Order, and welcome to the Work and Pensions Select Committee evidence session with the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, Liz Kendall, and the Permanent Secretary, Sir Peter Schofield. So it's lovely to welcome you both. Secretary of State, I understand you have a brief statement you'd like to make.
Actually, no, I don't. Let's crack on. I'm sure you've got lots of questions.
Well, thank you for that, and I'm going to kick off if that's all right. I think when you were with us before the committee back, in November last year, you talked about the importance to you for rebuilding trust with the public as a whole in terms of the role of the department that you're responsible for, but particularly about the people who you provide services for. And I wondered how you thought the last few weeks, and in particular the experience that and concerns that disabled people, vulnerable claimants will have experienced, whether that has contributed to rebuilding trust or not.
Well, I know always how anxious people are when they hear about proposed changes in the benefit system. I think we've ended up in the right place now, and I think we have a really positive story going forward about how we will work with disabled people, the organisations that represent them and other experts to make sure we get a system that's fit for the future. But I actually think we're doing some extremely important work to overhaul our safeguarding processes, and this is something that I know you personally chair and the committee as a whole has done a lot of work into. I hope you've received our initial response to the committee's report, but there is much more to come in the autumn. We are going through the process at the moment of reviewing every single aspect of our safeguarding process. I think we're going to be publishing the first ever report on our clinical governance today, later on. So there's a lot of work going on, but I'm absolutely sure there's lots more to do.
Thank you. Thank you for that. We're talking about the safeguarding response to our report. In our Safeguarding Vulnerable Claimants report published in May, we recommended that the department adopt a system-based approach to safeguarding, and as part of this, that for significant policies the department will consider the potential health impacts on claimants of the policy that was being implemented. We asked in the report that you confirm that the planned changes to health and disability benefits are, as set out in the Pathways to Work Green Paper, were prospectively assessed with respect to possible physical and mental health impacts on claimants. And I was unclear from your response whether that had been done.
Well, you will know with a huge number of both impact assessments and the evidence pack that we published alongside the original proposals went through some of the different impacts that those proposals would have had. And obviously as well, I know you within the report, you're asking for our Chief Medical Advisor to be obviously engaged and involved the whole way through that process, and that was absolutely the case. I'm really determined to ensure that all of the policies that we put forward absolutely have safeguarding the needs of vulnerable claimants at their heart. You'll know that we're going to produce a comprehensive system-wide approach in the autumn. As I said in our response to the committee's report, I aim to make a statement in Parliament about that. I think that's extremely important. I think that there is good work underway in the department. I know the Permanent Secretary is absolutely determined not just to have minimum standards but the highest possible standards. But I'm absolutely sure, whether it's looking at our training, at all of our processes, how we actually engage with claimants, making sure that there are all those safeguards in place, we need to make sure at every single step that that's being done. And I hope that once we've completed our review within the department, we publish our new approach, I make a statement to Parliament about it, people will be more reassured about how seriously we all take this issue.
And it might be worth just adding to that the role of the Chief Medical Advisor, who I think the committee has met.
A couple of times, yes.
Yeah, but she is, I mean, since she was appointed in September 2023, she's very much an integrated part of my senior director's leadership team. She's very influential, not just in terms of policy development and policy advice, but also in terms of operational activity. And it's all part of the work that the Secretary of State describes, which we're on a journey in DWP, but we're convinced that we're heading in the right direction, and the frameworks that the Secretary of State has described are absolutely underpinned by what we're doing operationally to deliver for our customers.
I absolutely understand. So can I understand then from the response, which did indicate that the Chief Medical Advisor had been engaged in this, but that there was a reluctance to publish anything? So has there been an assessment on the potential health impacts of the Pathways to Work Green Paper, and particularly thinking about the bill that went through Parliament, given what we know from previous reforms to disability benefits and the harms that have resulted specifically from that?
I think just to say on that you know that we don't publish advice to ministers, but absolutely the Chief Medical Advisor was involved in every step of the way on that. We have published evidence around the impact of those proposed changes on different types of groups with different conditions, and which groups of people would be more or less likely to be affected by the changes, some of which we're no longer going ahead with. So that information has been published, but I am always keen to make sure that we go through thoroughly any of these issues. And I think when you see our statement and review of safeguarding, we will be going through all of those issues as part of that. We've responded to your initial report. You'll understand we want to do our own review, complete it, develop policy and make a statement to Parliament about that. So we're sort of in, the in-between position at the moment, but I'm always keen to look at further suggestions.
So as a point of information, I think impact assessments can be seen as advisory documents, but they're not advice.
Policy
so they're
advice,
they're based on evidence, and I think that's really important distinction to make, particularly in areas around the impacts on health and the potential, as I've just said, about harms. But let's move on. Just very, very briefly, you'll be aware that in 2022, the Equality and Human Rights Commission decided to issue a Section 23 to the Department because of concerns about the deaths of claimants and other considerable issues within the Department. Obviously, last May, that was escalated to an investigation about the impact on discrimination against disabled people. Where are we up to with that now?
Yeah, I mean, there's not a lot more to say since we were last here, and obviously we've got an update in our annual report and accounts which we published on Thursday of last week. The Secretary of State and I met the Chair and Chief Executive of the EHRC in October, and we very much agreed that we wanted to work in a very collaborative, constructive way forward. Since then, the EHRC has asked for a number of pieces of information. They've had everything that they need. There's ongoing conversations going on. We're waiting to hear from them.
We seem to be at a similar sort of stage that we were with under the previous government. It doesn't look good, does it, in terms of the government being investigated?
We all want this resolved as soon as possible. I think I said last time I was here, I absolutely want to make sure that we are delivering not just on our legal responsibilities, but the highest possible standards. Been very open to that, and we, if anybody, want to get this sorted as quickly as possible.
Thank you, Steve Darling.
Thank you. So thank you very much for attending today. It was just last November when you were with us and reflecting on benefits for people with long-term health and disabilities. You talked about genuine engagement and not being led by cuts. And then in March, the paper's published without consultation with the highest level of cuts for the last 10 years. What engagement was done before that? What were the key drivers? What happened between those times to actually it appears abandonment of those core principles that you had in November to March? What went wrong?
You'll forgive me for not agreeing with the characterisation that you put forward. I've never started with pound signs or spreadsheets. I've always started with what I believe can help people with long-term health conditions and disabled people build a better life for themselves. And our reforms are based on helping those who can work to do so instead of writing them off and then denying them any support. Protecting those.
That's what really worries me. Is the whole of
cannot.
Is the whole of
if
this.
I can just finish answering your
but again,
understandable
PIP
question.
is not to do with work,
I'm
whether you
fully
can work
aware
or not.
that it is.
But it's this situation where there's all throughout this narrative, it's been suggested that PIP is an out of work benefit, where it's an in-work benefit.
I've never suggested that.
I think you've given that impression when responding to myself and colleagues in the chamber.
I have never believed it because it's not true, and that is not the argument I made. The argument I did make was that we need to make sure that this absolutely crucial benefit is sustainable for the future, and that a doubling of the number of people on PIP over the last decade, if that were to continue into the future, that my real concern is that the benefit, which is absolutely vital for people, won't continue in future. Now, where we've ended up, I think, is a good position where we will make sure that we work with disabled people, the organisations that represent them, to take a really good long-term look at this benefit, to make sure it really is there for those who need it, and that it reflects, as you will have seen in the terms of reference for the so-called Tim's review, that it actually genuinely is there for people who need it in future and takes into account the big changes that we've seen in disability, in society, in the world of work since PIP came into place over a decade ago. I think that's a really important review, and I hope to engage, and I'm absolutely sure we will, all members on this committee.
So can you please explain, and I'm speaking as somebody who's registered blind themselves, why did you choose not to consult on that element of change that you were pushing forward in March?
Because it was going through at the time, in primary legislation, and we were consulting, obviously, with Parliament about that. And I actually do not agree that the paper as a whole, the Pathways to Work Green Paper, somehow lacked consultation with disabled people. You know, we've got 5 collaboration committees along many different aspects of that Green Paper, on employment support, on de-risking work and the right to try and
on the PIP you didn't consult, is that
people.
right? There was no consultation on the cuts to
Well, there
PIP.
was with Parliament, and Parliament took a different view.
But you said in November that you wanted to consult with disabled people, and then it comes to the biggest cut in a decade.
Aspects.
But it comes, but not on that. And can you explain why you chose?
We are now going
Can you
forward.
explain why you chose not to at that time?
Because
what was your thoughts behind that?
We were passing it through Parliament.
But why did you ignore disabled people, please?
Well, I have answered that question. You might not like the answer, but the answer is because we were consulting with Parliament. Parliament took a different view.
That's
and
not
now
disabled
going
people.
forward, and
That's
now
not disabled people. And why did you ignore disabled people then, please?
Well, we are not ignoring disabled people. They will be at the heart of the Tim's review.
But you ignored them, and in March. Can you explain why?
We did not ignore. In fact, you
chose not to consult.
The very day after we published the Green Paper, myself and Stephen Timms, in the next couple of days, had roundtables with disabled people and the organisations that represent them. So, we will just have to agree to disagree on this. I do not believe that we have failed to consult disabled people on the Pathways to Work Green Paper, and going forward, we are going to be co-producing the review of PIP in the longer term.
Thank you, Chair.
Did you want to come in?
Well, I was going to come on to the bill itself, if I may. Secretary of State, thank you. I don't want to exploit all the political problems you've had, and I appreciate the hard work you and the Minister have done on this. So my commiserations for the battles you've fought and lost. Although actually I'm just struck by what you said about getting to the right place. I mean, my suspicion is that actually we are now where you and the Minister probably did want to get to. You know, we don't have reform of PIP coming, at least for another year. Well, we won't even know what the outlines of the reform might be until next autumn, with changes to come much later. And what we're not going to have either is any savings, either now or subsequent to that review, because as Stephen Timms has clarified, there is no intention to make any reductions in spending through his review. So I'd just like you, if you would, to confirm that the intention is not to...
We're not driven...
Go on to my next question, if you don't mind.
Sorry, yeah.
Just because that interested to hear your views on that. But then more generally, my question is, you know, there are two ways to overall reduce welfare expenditure, and one is to reduce the supply of it by introducing cuts, which was the intention of the Treasury at least until the U-turn, and the other is to reduce the demand for it by supporting people to live independently. Am I right now in thinking that the position of the department is to reduce overall expenditure over the long term through demand reduction by employment support and others, rather than by reducing entitlements?
So I've always believed that the way to really get the welfare bill on a more sustainable footing, and I said in my earlier comments that for me does remain essential, because I want to see a welfare state that is really there for people who need it in future. And as we live for longer and more of us live with long-term conditions and there are more disabled people, we have to make sure that the whole system works for years and years to come. And I think the reason why we are in the problems that we are as a country is we've failed on welfare because we've failed on work. And so there's two things that we're doing. I don't entirely agree with your characteristic. Firstly is we have to have, I believe, a much more proactive, pro-work system. The heart of the bill, I understand why it's not characterised at that, but the heart of the bill that we put forward was to deal with perverse incentives in the system, where essentially people are almost incentivised to define themselves as incapable of work in order to be able to afford to live, which is why we are freezing and then reducing the universal credit health top-up, why we're introducing a right to try so people can take the risk and try work. But there's also the employment. So I don't entirely agree it's all about employment support, but that is a large part of it, because instead of a system where if you defined yourself as incapable of work, you were then left without any support, we want to start to try and change that, to engage with people, get people on a pathway. Now, for some people, as I've said before, literally getting out of the house would be a step forward. Being able to actually have confidence to talk to people and be around other people would be a big step forward. Some need skills, but it is a pathway to work. So we need to remove disincentives in the system, in the benefit system, and we need to provide a pathway to work for those who can work now or at some point near into the future. So I don't entirely agree with your characterisation there.
Very quickly.
There's still a £50 a week incentive to present as incapable of work through the reduced but still substantial LTWRA entitlement. Surely the logic of what you're saying is that should be scrapped altogether, and that PIP should be the benefit that people receive to help them cope with the cost of disability.
We've begun to tackle those disincentives. I think that the change in UC Health combined with this really substantial employment support, and I should say here, it's absolutely essential that we get that employment support right based on the evidence of what actually helps people move towards and to get work. Together, I think that is a decisive shift from the system that we inherited, proactive, pro-work. There is more to do, and we'll see that. You know, we've finished the consultation on the Pathways to Work Green Paper. There were many more ideas in that, but how we actually have that proactive pro-work system is a big change, and we are continuing to make those reforms. Thank you.
Bill German.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome, Secretary of State. So you've talked about the employment support that we want to ramp up for disabled people, and the Pathways to Work Green Paper discusses that and the investment put into it. Is that level of investment still possible, given the changes to the original proposals on welfare reform?
Yes, that is, and in fact, it's more now with the additional £300 million that we announced during the passage of the bill. So this will now ramp up to 3.8 billion in total. There was already investment in the system that we'd put in, but this is additional funding for that. We're going to be bringing some of that forward and ramping up support over the next 2 to 3 years to make sure that in every part of the country there is proper employment support for people with long-term health conditions and disabilities, to make sure that those who can work get the chance to do so.
Thank you. And Sir Charlie Mayfield, of course, has played a really important role in this. So he's talked about changing the landscape of support for disabled people in the workplace from an employer's perspective. So I wondered what kind of changes we might expect to see by the end of the Parliament, and also which ones we can really ramp up now to get maximum benefit early on.
So this is a really important point, and I should have said this to Mr. Kruger earlier as well. The part of the agenda about preventing people from falling out of work due to a health condition in the first place is as important as getting people back to work. We know, I think it's around 300,000 people every year fall out of work due to a long-term health condition. And I mean, the committee may want to bring Sir Charlie here to give evidence himself. He has been looking at what's happening in this country to actually keep people in work, but also what other countries are doing. And the key here is actually much earlier intervention. First of all, we want to prevent people from getting to that position in the first place, but there is very, very strong evidence that if you're out of work for more than a year, if you come off, you're off sick pay and you're out of work for more than a year, if you don't get back in that first year, your likelihood of getting back to work is far, far less. So that is the real thing that we want to focus on. And there's a whole range of things that some companies are doing, good companies. We want to see what more we can do to bring the rest up to the best. We want to look at international evidence about that. And this is not just because we think that's right for people who want to have a chance to stay and work or get back to work, but actually businesses increasingly are worried about the cost of people going off long-term on sick, the retaining staff, how vital that is. So I think, for me, public services and the world of work need to wake up to the fact that as we live for longer and more of us have health conditions and are caring for longer, we need a big, big change. And I made a speech at the IPPR saying recently where I've reflected on what happened when, back in the day, women were arguing, okay, we want to work. Yes, we have children, but we need good maternity pay and leave. We need childcare. We need flexible working. And how did we get record numbers of women into work? Partly we changed the law, but we also put in place those public services, and we changed the culture of work. And I think with an ageing society, we've now got to think much more seriously about that for sick and disabled people, because the truth is, as we live for longer, we are going to have to work for longer. So I see it as a big societal change. Yes, government has a role in that, but the bottom line is we have to work together with businesses, with the public sector, with the NHS, and we're just not doing that at anywhere near the level we need if we're going to improve people's life chances. So that is my big mission on these areas.
Thank you. And we're over to Jo Baxter.
Thank you, Chair. So the Public Accounts Committee recently said it would be very challenging to meet the government's aim of an 80% employment rate. So given the budget that the department has, do you think the 80% employment rate is feasible and or achievable?
Well, it's definitely a stretching target, but I'm not in, I mean, to state the obvious, I'm not in politics to be coasting along, you know? We want that stretching target. We've said it's a big ambition over a decade, but actually if you know, our employment rate I think is just over 75%, but there are other countries, Switzerland and the Netherlands, who are over 80%, Japan I think is just under 80%, Germany 78%, so we do want to be up there with the best. I don't think it's acceptable that our employment rate has not got back to pre-pandemic levels. We're the only country in the G7 where that hasn't happened. And, you know, if you look back at the original Beveridge report, Beveridge said social security alone would never be enough to give people a good life. It needed to be combined with full and fulfilling employment, those are my words, not his, and an NHS that's as much about rehabilitation as cure. Now, actually, those principles remain true today. So it is stretching, and it should be, because people deserve a chance to work. And actually, we have seen in the 1 year since this government was elected, 500,000 more people in employment. You know, that is, the employment rate has gone up. Economic inactivity has come down by 300,000. We've created 380,000 more jobs. There is a long way to go, but we have set our job centres new metrics. Yeah. You know, it's a complete change for our job centres. Reduce the disparity in the employment gap between different regions. The employment rate for lone parents, for disabled people. We want to get it up right across the board. Sorry, Peter.
No, I was going to go into exactly that same point that you were making, Secretary of State, that the Secretary of State and Ministerial team have set us 8 metrics which get into the heart of this, because there are parts of the country where indeed the employment rate is above 80%, and there are groups in the country where employment rate is above 80%. The focus needs to be on those places or those demographic groups where it is below, where there is that gap. And that is something that it gives us the thing to aim for, doesn't it? The sort of interim stages before we get finally to 80%. And we've been absolutely set that framework by the ministerial team, and we're driving towards it.
Just on this point about the focus of job centres, so the Minister for Employment told us that one of her priorities is for work coaches to have more time with claimants. So subsequently, Permanent Secretary, you told the Public Accounts Committee, because I was at the evidence session, that the DWP will be reducing the length and frequency of many work coach meetings, because the evidence showed it does not make a difference to outcomes. So I guess my question, Secretary of State, is if work coach support doesn't help people find work, why is it mandatory for millions of people to meet with work coaches?
Shall I build on that? Because, Ms Baxter was, as you say, at the Public Accounts Committee session in May, where we were talking about the creation of the Jobs and Careers Service and the opportunity there to take our existing resource of work coaches, who are focused primarily on the intensive work search group within Universal Credit, and move beyond that, because as the Secretary of State has said, our priority is to go beyond just the intensive work search group to support people, particularly people with health conditions, who previously have been left out of any support at all. So what we've been doing as part of the Job Centre Activity Review is try to work out where we can best deploy our work coach resource, so that those people for whom that resource could be more closely targeted enables us to free up resource for those groups who currently don't get it at all. So some of the things we're doing have been to reduce some support where it's been less needed, but that's to free up resource elsewhere, and 1,000 work coaches are being released to support people on the Universal Credit Health Journey as part of this programme. So that's where it's going. It's to support additional support elsewhere. I was again at the Public Accounts Committee on Monday, and the chair was asking me again about this, particularly it's the claimant commitment review, claimant commitment stage, where we've reduced from 50 minutes below that. What I said is that where you have a situation where a claimant needs longer, if a work coach is thinking, well, I'm 20 minutes in, actually I could do with that extra half hour, then that can normally be accommodated because we want to do the right thing. But it's really about trying to make sure we don't spend time on the things that add small amounts of value to free up our work coaches, as I say, the 1,000 work coaches who are going to be putting in place over the course of this year to support customers on the health journey.
I just wanted to add a tiny bit to this, which is we did some fantastic work, additional work coach time, which is precisely to what is the evidence when we free up our work coaches to focus on those with health conditions and disabilities. And we found that just by calling, asking if they wanted to come in for a meeting, we got 3% more people into work. Now 3% sounds small, but of 2.8 million people currently out of work due to long-term sickness, that's really, really good. But even better than that, 3% more in work, but mental well-being improved. We were actually, some of them referring them on to mental health services. Financially better off because we referred people to debt advice to get the finances back on track. So we've got a resource. The resources aren't infinite. Our work coaches themselves say we don't need to focus on those people. We can do that over the phone or online. These are the people we need to spend more time with. And that's the amazing thing about them, our work coaches, is they know what's what. They know their local economy, they know what people need. And we do actually have evidence that if you spend more time with people, refer them on to the right services, they can get work and they can be financially better off.
So just my final part of this section is just, so I'm a former trade union official. I believe in good work. So not just any job, but jobs where people have good terms and conditions, where they feel secure, where they are developed, where they have agency and a voice and security. So how do you, and I do agree, work coaches are phenomenal. I've met many in my local job centre. How do you ensure that work coaches have the time to make sure that they're not pushing people into any job, but that we are making sure people get good work and good jobs with good terms and conditions?
Well, this is one of the whole points of our reform of job centres, is that we better match the people who need work with the jobs that they need to get, and ideally to get on in their jobs too. I'd say it's not just about what we do within the DWP. We've got our employment rights legislation to improve the quality of work. We're creating more good jobs. We've invested, £113 billion over the SR in building new homes and clean energy. But we're also looking at what we can do as a department with other government departments. I've already met with Ed Miliband and everyone who's involved in the clean energy workforce strategy to say, okay, you're going to be creating these jobs. How do we get our people into those jobs? What's the partnership we can build? Similarly, with the construction industry, because we're building 1.5 million new homes, but there's much more we can do. We're investing in our water infrastructure, creating new jobs. On defence, I think that this is about government saying we've got to be much more joined up. And the DWP, we want to go out there and do a deal with those employers and say we are overhauling our approach to employers. It's not acceptable that only 1 in 6 employers has ever used a job centre to recruit. So we're overhauling that. We've got a dedicated team now in the department. They're going to have single account managers. We want to do much more as a partnership there. So there's a long way to go, but we have made a good start in this first year in office.
And in the job centre, I regularly sit alongside work coaches in job centres, and the conversation is all about, well, what can you do? Let's understand your skills, let's understand your employment history and your aspirations and what you want to do. And connected to employers in the way the Secretary of State has described, but one of the particular successes that we've had over the last few years is sector-based work academies, where we work closely with employers to give our claimants the opportunity to have work experience and training, leading to a guaranteed job interview at the end of that. And there were over 80,000 of those over the course of last year. That's directly connecting people to those roles. And many of those are in the sectors that the Secretary of State has described: good jobs, growing jobs, good opportunities for people.
Any crew there?
Very quickly, job coaches tell me one real problem they've got is employers concerned about the national insurance rise. Has the department done an analysis of the likely impact on both the supply of jobs but also on wages in consequence of the national insurance rise itself?
Well, actually, my experience of talking to employers even since that rise is many are desperate to recruit. You know, they've got jobs that they really need skills for. We've got people who are out of work who we need to get those skills. So, as I said earlier, we want to make sure that we much better match the needs of employers with the right people who are coming through from us. And actually, I know that businesses, are under a lot of pressure. But actually, the ones that I've spoken to are still much more likely to talk about the challenges of recruiting, not that they are not recruiting at all. They are desperate to get people to work in those, particularly in those growth sectors that the government is funding.
I just asked the Permanent Secretary what work the department has done to assess the impact of the national insurance rise on the jobs market.
Those assessments are done by the ABR, and they were published alongside those fiscal statements in the normal way.
Frank McNally.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, Secretary of State, Permanent Secretary. We're grateful to you both for joining us this morning. Can I ask you about the planned unemployment insurance benefit set for 28-29? And I suppose this maybe follows on a bit from Joanna's question. I think this has the potential to be really transformative and really support people who will be in that devastating position of losing a job in terms of income protection. Can I ask you specifically around the plans to support, and I quote, people to find a new job that makes the most of their skills, end quote. What will the structure of that benefit look like to ensure that we're achieving that ambitious goal?
You'll know in the Green Paper we're consulting on this, a new unemployment insurance, a new contributory benefit, which would be non-means tested and set at a higher rate for those who've paid into the system. And the argument behind this is, we have the two separate JSA and ESA at the moment, and it's to say, actually in that really crucial part where you lose a job, how we can better support people. I mean, they don't have to define themselves as incapable of work for health reasons. How we actually revive the contributory principle. And crucially, I think I said a bit about this with the Mayfield review, it's during that early period where you're out of work, how we actually pile in support to help you as quickly as possible get back into work, because we know once you're out, once you're on the health top-up, I think it's fewer than 3% of people a year actually get back into work. So this is something that we are consulting on. We haven't developed any further proposals yet. You will have to wait till we obviously go through all the consultation responses to the Green Paper, but it is very much about making sure we better support people during that early phase, get them back into work as quickly as possible. Do not put another disincentive in the system, which is defining yourself as incapable of work. And revive that principle that if you paid in, you should get out.
Yep, I appreciate Secretary of State. It's a consultation, and there'll be an outcome to that, and an analysis of the the findings of that. But I suppose within the flexibility that we would be looking at for a benefit of this nature, can you expand on whether you would expect claimants, for example, to be permitted to reject potential job matches? There have been some concerns that people who have got medium to high skills may feel forced into work that is perhaps not suited to their skills, but forced to maybe go down that route to avoid sanction. Is that something that the department is mindful of?
It's something we're absolutely mindful of, and as I say, my experience of working with work coaches is they absolutely start with the track record that the claimant might have in employment, the skills that they've got, and how can they get into a role that is appropriate to that skill base, and give them the time to do that. Obviously, if it's been a long time and they can't get back into that, then there needs to be a different type of conversation, but that's where the conversation generally starts, in my experience.
No, what we want is for people to get into jobs and to stay in those jobs, and that is always better done when you match what people's skills are and what they want for their lives with the appropriate jobs. Now, that is not always available, but that's partly why this government wants to try and create more better jobs in every part of the country. I never see the work of the DWP as somehow separate from the rest of the government's strategy, which is to say we don't have enough good jobs in this country. We want to improve the quality of jobs that already exist, but we need to create them, because all of the problems we have discussed are far worse in the parts of the country that struggled for decades, places where whole industries closed, and where we need to create those opportunities. That's why, if you look at whether it's those on disability benefits, young people who are not in education, employment or training, those who are claiming universal credit, all of those problems are concentrated in parts of the countries. The parts of the countries we're in, many of us came into politics to represent, and that this department's work is intrinsically linked with those of other government departments. And one of the things that I know Peter feels as strongly about as I do, actually, is that this department ends up picking up the pieces of the problems that are deep-rooted from many other government areas. Now, we've got to change that. We cannot work in those silos. I mean, poor health, poor opportunities, low skills, not enough jobs. Those are the problems we have to tackle together. We're at the sharp end of it. But, and it comes back to some of the points that have been raised earlier about what's happened, admittedly, a bumpy ride over the welfare legislation. But we have to start shifting resources into the things that really help create better lives for people. And we are spending, I believe, too much on the costs of failure and not enough on the better health, better jobs, better skills that we need. That is extremely difficult to shift, but because people rely on those benefits and they've built their lives around them. But unless we grapple with this, benefits alone is not the solution to a better life. I mean, although obviously that is the focus of this committee's discussions.
I welcome much of what you said there, Secretary of State. I represent former mining villages, and Coatbridge in my constituency was a big steel town, and we still feel the consequences of that inaction, that deindustrialisation that impacted so many of our communities in the 80s. Can I just my final question on this before I pass back to the chair is around binary distinction for job seekers who can work, who can or cannot work within this new unemployment insurance benefit. What risks or perhaps unintended consequences would you see for people who, for job seekers who maybe cannot work because of ill health or disability, but end up not being eligible for PIP post the TIMS review?
So I think that we've got to be really clear-sighted about the fact that and this is an issue that came up discussing the legislation, was about the fluctuating nature of many health conditions, and that we need a benefit system that actually reflects that some people we know are able to work at some weeks, not others, some days, not others. How do we have a system that better actually doesn't require those people to always define themselves as incapable of work, that we have a separate set, whatever the spokesperson for the Liberal Democrats said. I'm perfectly well aware that personal independent payments are not linked to your ability to work. They are about the extra costs of living with a disability. What does that mean in the modern world? What more can health and care services do to support people? The nature of those conditions with this increase in mental health claims. All of this has to be reflected in the benefit system. It can't stand still. But these are extremely difficult challenges. But I think, as a whole, the Pathways to Work Green Paper actually did set out a route to better reflecting all of those issues and concerns. But there's a lot more work to do.
David Pinto-Dziuczynski.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Secretary of State and Permanent Secretary, for coming to speak to us today. I'd like to shift the conversation to the topic of pensions, if we can. So obviously there is a bill going through passage in the House at the moment, the Pension Schemes Bill, and obviously we had the Mansion House speech last night and the Mansion House Accord signed just weeks before. One of the issues that both the bill and the Accord raised was around getting best outcomes for savers and pension savers. And I know that, for instance, research shows that just 5% of the pension pot invested early in a career, age 25, in private assets can raise the final pension pot size by 7 to 12%. At second reading, the Pensions Minister said that the fiduciary duty to act in pension savers' best interest was not always operating to produce the best outcomes, and that, quote, savers were being let down by the status quo. What concrete plans do you have to address this? And are you considering setting out new guidance around that issue?
Well, you know, on the main purpose of the pension schemes bill is to try and produce better results for UK pensioners and savers, but also for UK PLC to start switching some of those investments. And the main way we're doing that is by trying to consolidate those small pension pots into larger funds that are able to take more risks. And I think that's a really important thing that we're doing. There'll be more to say about pensions before the House goes into recess. Some of the longer-term challenges facing today's workers and tomorrow's pensioners, because I'm very concerned about the adequacy of pensions, that there are many people who are, the huge benefits of auto-enrolment, but many people still not saving, and that is a real risk for people going forward. We'll have more to say about that next week, but I think the Pension Schemes Bill is a really important first step to try and bring those small pension pots together, better results for savers, and better results for the UK economy.
Yes, I think this is a major innovation, isn't it? And getting into the whole question of value for money for savers and all that we can do on that. I think greater transparency around the value for money for savers is really important. The other area I think we should also focus on is the lack of or the quality advice that savers have in terms of what's available, what the right choices are for them to make. And there's major kind of steps forward on that, both in terms of the things that the government are doing, but also the work of the Money and Pension Service. And of course, the progress on the Pensions Dashboard programme, which will enable savers to see what their savings are and hopefully be able to make right decisions off the back of that.
Thank you for that. And you mentioned adequacy. You're absolutely right to raise that. So I think I'm right in saying that 2 in 5 people in the working age population do not have adequate savings to sustain them at a reasonable level in retirement. Just picking up on that thread, what steps are you taking on adequacy?
Well, we'll be saying more soon about the next phase of our pensions review. I am concerned of the risk that, you know, tomorrow's pensioners will be poorer than today's. As a Labour politician, I do not accept that that is good enough, and we need to face that head on. I'm concerned particularly about those on low incomes who are, you know, they can't even put food on the table, let alone thinking about paying for their pension in retirement. We've got more people who are still paying off their mortgages when they retire, and more people who'll be renting into retirement. And how I see this in the broad sweep of history is that we made some massive improvements under the last Labour government of tackling pensioner poverty through pension credit and then through the Turner Review. And that was an amazing success of public policy, actually, an amazing success of public policy. But there are new problems today, and I don't accept that tomorrow's pensioners should be poorer than today's. But that means we've got to do the long-term thinking and build the consensus that we need to give people, you know, a decent. We all want to look forward to our retirement. But as you say, 40% of people are not going to retire on the minimum defined adequate income. And the truth is that would be terrible for them, but we'll all end up picking up the pieces of pensioner poverty. So we've got to take some difficult, longer-term decisions to tackle those problems.
Thank you. I'm going to take a break now for approximately 5 minutes. Order. carry on if that's all right. And I just want to ask in relation to the predecessor committee's recommendations around indexation for the from the indexation of PPF compensation on pre-1997 benefits in relation to the scheme rules for this. Former Chief Executive Oliver Morley said that there was a case for this, and the level of PPF reserves, which is now stands at 14 billion, has since increased. He told us that the barrier is that the reserves are on the public sector balance sheet. How long has this been the case, and have there been any changes in how PPF assets and liabilities are treated?
Yes, well, the Pension Protection Fund has been a public corporation since it was set up, so it's always been on the public balance sheet. The reserves have always been on the public balance sheet. The particular way in which the fiscal aggregates work at the moment is that the government takes account of financial assets as part of its key fiscal rules around debt and the capital position. So the crucial thing, and going back to the recommendations from the predecessor committee, to do anything on pre-indexation, and I know you had evidence from the Minister for Pensions last month, and I think he subsequently has written to the committee. But I mean, the crucial thing to say is that any decision on the indexation of pre-1997 assets is a fiscal decision that needs to be made alongside other fiscal decisions in the normal way.
Thank you for that. I understood it only came on the public sector balance sheets in the last few years, actually. So I'm interested in why that was the case. But I wonder if you can understand from the perspective of scheme members that they've had their pension in real terms just eroded. It's their savings, their investment in the scheme that has contributed to the PPF reserves, not insignificant reserves. You know, how can we justify this to them? Many of them in their late 70s and 80s who are literally clinging on, and given what Secretary of State just mentioned earlier on.
1997 was the year that legislation was introduced to require indexation. So I appreciate that many schemes did have indexation prior to 1997, but it wasn't a requirement until after 1997, which I think is the reason for the current status. At the end of the day, I mean, that £14 billion of reserves, those reserves are there to fulfil the role of the Pension Protection Fund, which is to step in if they need to, if a DB scheme runs into trouble. And obviously it's difficult to predict the future requirement of those reserves, but that's what they're primarily there for.
Can I just, I mean, in December 2024, it was estimated that if a modest increase of 2.5% was given to the remaining members of PPF, of the scheme rather, it would be a total of about 133 million over 10 years. We're not talking about massive sums in terms of the overall public sector spending, but to the people that are living from day to day and really, really struggling, you know, it would be a real significant difference. So I understand the justification, but the humanity of where we are now and the position that these people are in now, what can we do for them?
When Torsten Bell came to speak to the committee, you know, he said he was absolutely aware of those points that you've raised, the older pensioners, many women, and has, you know, he's personally met many and is fully aware of all of those, but there are obviously also wider implications for the public finances. I think he told you he's aware of that.
This is their money.
Absolutely.
Their money that they have in terms of the levy that has gone into PPF. Their money, it's not tax, but it's their money that has been used to provide that levy. And surely they should have a call on that as well.
I think, as Torsten said to you, we're really aware of what's happening and the implications, that there are implications for the public finances. Any decisions has got to be taken with that absolutely in mind, but he is fully aware of it, and I think he told you he's looking into it, he's fully aware of it, but there are wider implications for the public finances, and I can't really go beyond that point that he made to you. I think it was back in June.
He did. Obviously, we had the pension scheme bill coming up, and I hope that there will be an opportunity to consider some amendments. They are dying by the day, the remaining ones. Surely, in terms of decency and humanity, we can do something for them. And
I understand this is something that previous committee and you have pushed. I think Torsten was very open about understanding all of those implications when he last came here, and has written to the committee and given evidence to you, and that's where we are at the moment.
Okay, I'll just leave this 133 million next 10 years against 14 billion. I'll just leave it at that. Okay, let's move on. Next on my list is Frank.
Thank you very much, Chair. Secretary of State, the Pensions Ombudsman, as you'll know, set up the Pension Dishonesty Unit to investigate allegations of fraudulent behaviour and misappropriation of pension funds. It supported 800 people and directed redress of more than £40 million. Last month, the committee was advised that DWP funding for the Pension Dishonesty Unit had come to an end. What was the reason for that decision?
Yeah, shall I come in on that, Mr.
Yep,
McNally? And I think, as you say, the Ombudsman Chief Executive wrote to the committee with a bit more detail about that. But the reality was that the unit was successful at making determinations, but very unsuccessful about securing funding coming back. And so this was just a question about what is the best way of using the resources for the Ombudsman in terms of getting the most outcomes. And it was concluded that putting that resource back into business as usual activity within the Ombudsman was a more effective use of those resources. Let's remember that all those affected would already have been receiving compensation through the Fraud Compensation Fund. So this is a question about, not a question about those who were affected, but more a question about best use of resources and whether this is a route that enables us to get money back from those people who were found guilty of fraudulent behaviour. And as I say, in the end, a lot of determinations made, but very little money secured. So it was just simply a value for money decision about how best to use taxpayers' money.
Okay, thank you for that, Permanent Secretary. I appreciate your views on that. The Ombudsman themselves have stated that from October this year the expectation would be that they would have to discontinue 50 complaints involving 17 schemes. What concerns do you as Permanent Secretary or Secretary of State do you hold on this, especially as the key purpose of the unit was to provide victims with a voice and shine a light on pension scams, and what other avenue would you see to ensure that those sort of 50 complaints involving 17 schemes continue to be investigated to an outcome?
Well, the Ombudsman plays an important role, as you say, in identifying those scams and those fraudsters, and we're always keen to take action to address that. What's proved to be the case is that the work of this particular unit has not been an effective use of taxpayers' money. But for those affected, the Fraud Compensation Fund is the route forward to get redress. And indeed, the work of the Ombudsman as a whole, by using this money in a different way to get through more business as usual cases, I imagine that they will identify more, as a result, more cases that need to be addressed by using the resources more effectively than by pursuing this particular route, which, as I say, the unit was successful at making determinations, but very unsuccessful about securing money back.
Do you think there are additional resources that need to be put into areas that you deem to be more successful to get on top of some of these challenging and complex matters?
Yeah. I mean, look, Dominic Harris, the Chief Executive and Accounting Officer of the Pensions Ombudsman, is doing a good job in using the resources most effectively. Obviously, we have a conversation in the context of spending reviews about the ongoing resources of the Pensions Ombudsman, but I'm confident in him and his leadership that they're using the resources that they've got in the most effective way to make the biggest difference.
I mean, if people have been defrauded out of their money, we want them to get it back, and we've got to make sure that we do that as effectively as possible. And if what happened here was actually the money we weren't getting as much of that back as we wanted to be able to do, so a change has been made, but I want to make sure that this is tackled properly, and we'll make sure that we keep that under review, because it's not acceptable if that's happened to people. We need to find the best way of doing it. If what we're doing isn't working, we have to have another look again, and that is absolutely a sort of clear commitment from us.
Appreciate that.
Amanda Hack.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the Secretary of State and the Permanent Secretary for being with us today. This did get raised in our previous question, but I just wanted to delve a little deeper into the pensions dashboard, much long awaited, and a project that has been reset more than once already. So in March, Brian Burns of Moneybox said he was concerned there was still no launch date for the Money Helper dashboard, and he was a bit sceptical of the launch date that the private sector would follow. So what's your working assumption of when the launch will happen to really sort of benefit people with claiming their lost pension, so to speak?
Thanks, Ms. Hack. I mean, as you say, it's a really important programme for the reasons I was raising with Mr. Pinto-Chinsky just a moment ago before the break. And as you say, it's a programme that did go through a reset. We put it into reset in 2023. Then we brought new leadership in, also new leadership in the Money and Pensions Service at Chair and Chief Executive level. And I am pleased with the progress that they've made. They are on track. The first connections have been made since April this year. Indeed, the state pension system is now being connected up. And we are on track for reaching the final connection date, which is the 31st of October 2026. Alongside that, we're doing work around developing the front end, the Money Helper dashboard, as you say. The Money and Pension Service are doing a lot of user testing to try and work out how best to use that. I want to make sure that the information is displayed in a way that is helpful. So it's one thing getting the system working in terms of I like to think of it as the plumbing. The connections through from each of the thousands of pension schemes there are is a complex job. But then bring that information to people, which, as we said earlier, is complex, and we need to make sure that people have the right understanding and make the right decisions off the back of that. I think that is really important. There's a lot of potential here, potentially some risk too. So that's why everyone wants to get this right. There's user testing. We don't have a date for when the Money Helper dashboard will be ready. As I say, the final connection date is the 31st of October 2026, and we're all set for that. We can keep the committee up to date with that. I'm sure the Money and Pension Service, as they come and report regularly to this committee, will do that too. But it's really, the programme's going well, the infrastructure's going well. We just want to make sure that when we display the information, we do this in a way that is most helpful for customers.
Yeah, I mean, certainly under question, and one of the things that I was really nervous about actually is if people felt that adequacy was of real worry, that actually that may have a negative effect, and how we needed to deal with that, giving people the right advice that they needed. So with this sort of essence, what we also heard from the evidence was that in other countries where this has been successfully rolled out, the private sector had really had an important role to play. So how do we keep the private sector engaged while there's still a little bit of uncertainty after connection when it will actually be up and running as a dashboard?
It's a good point. There's a lot of engagement going on from the Money and Pension Service. They're well connected in, obviously, through everything else they do to that wider sector, and the pension schemes themselves are well embedded in because they are providing the infrastructure and connecting up the system. I think the current plan is still that the money helper dashboard will be the first one to market. Obviously, commercial ones can flow after that. But I think for all the reasons you've described, making sure that we are doing this in the right way with proper user testing under controlled situation is the best way forward. Ultimately, though, we imagine that there will be a number of dashboards out there displaying information in more innovative ways. But it is so important. I mean, this is such an important step forward, isn't it? But it's so important that we get it right.
Yeah, and obviously we have reflected on about actually pension adequacy. So how do you vision that these dashboards will change people's view about how retirement looks for them? What kind of behaviour change are we sort of anticipating?
Well, shall I have a go? And the Secretary of State may want to add to that. But I do think information presented clearly and in a straightforward way is at the heart of this. As we said earlier, making decisions to save for retirement early on in life are the right things to do. It makes such a difference. And yet it's something that so many people put to one side until later on in their career. So having this as something that people can have easy access to, I mean, it's not the same as looking at your bank account because the numbers are presumably, hopefully, not going to be moving up and down too regularly. But being able to, at those regular points in life, to be able to think about, am I making the right decisions about spending money now or investing in the future for my retirement, and sort of seeing the difference that choices they make have is so important. Added to that, we know that so many people, particularly in the way that careers work at the moment, have a variety of different pension pots in different places, and maybe some that they've become disconnected from. So having information about the money that they have themselves is another important part of this too. I anticipate and I hope that this leads to people making those long-term decisions in a controlled, mature way, seeking advice. But we need the whole infrastructure to work effectively, and we need to avoid people providing the wrong information or encouraging people to do the wrong thing based on the information that comes out in the dashboard. And there is that risk of that if we don't get it right.
I would just add one of the things we're obviously thinking seriously about is with pension freedoms, really, there's big decisions even when you do gain access to your pension about how you're really going to make the best use of that for what are longer retirements as we live for longer. And knowledge is power, but we've got to make sure that yes, the plumbing, and as you refer to it, and the information is all there, but the truth is and we've probably all around this in this room, ourselves looked at what's happening for our constituents and sort of the huge challenges we've got here. But I see this as a really important part of the next steps as we make sure that people have a retirement that they can look forward to, the information, the knowledge and the advice they need to make sure their money and their savings actually work for them as we do live for longer. This is a really important thing, but I think there's much more that we can do there.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Steve Darling.
Thank you. Bearing in mind that we've got 4.5 million children living in poverty, and childhood is a very short period of all of our lives, it's particularly disappointing the slippage that we've had on the child poverty strategy from being published earlier this summer until potentially the autumn. Can you give a clear date as to when that will be published, and can you please explain why the unfortunate slippage?
It will be in the autumn. I can't give you an exact date, but I do not believe there has been slippage in this government's determination to tackle child poverty. We have introduced a fair repayment rate in universal credit to stop people being plunged into debt. We're introducing free school meals for all children in households on universal credit, which will lift 100,000 children out of poverty. We're dealing with direct pay in the child maintenance service, which we believe will lift 20,000 children out of poverty. We're rolling out
Can you
free
please
breakfast
explain
clubs.
why did the slippage happen?
I'm replying. You said that there was slippage. I actually think we have taken action and made a down payment on tackling child poverty.
So
and
it's
I'm
not going to have any impact then, the child poverty strategy. It doesn't matter. Can you explain why the delay? You had planned to do it earlier this year. Now it's going to be the autumn, so that could be, knowing the government, December. Childhood is a really short period of time. We're letting our children in poverty down. Why is the government doing that by not publishing as it promised previously?
I think action speaks louder than words. We've taken action to tackle child poverty.
Can you explain why you haven't published the child poverty strategy so far?
Would you like me to answer the question?
Yeah, no, well, you're very well avoiding it. Why have you not published the child poverty strategy?
We want to get this right, and we understand that there will be funding implications, and we think it's really important that we spell out a comprehensive strategy, but we have not had slippage on tackling child poverty. We're putting that into action.
Thank you.
Amanda Hack.
Thank you. I think one of the things that's been really positive in terms of looking at child poverty is the actions we have already taken. I think the free school meals that will be rolled out next September will have a real step forward in terms of actually how many children can access a free school meal. So in terms of the review and the analysis, what does that tell us about that one, just that one bit of policy will actually, how that will improve child poverty?
So this is really important to me personally. I used to chair something called Feeding Leicester, which is the programme to end hunger in my city, and that emerged from a survey we did back in, I think it was 2018, that showed 1 in 5, this is even before COVID, that 1 in 5 kids in our city every single day worried about having enough to eat. And that's why we set up Feeding Leicester. And kids can't do well if they haven't got enough food in their bellies. And I'm extremely proud of the free school meals for those on universal credit. It will be available will lift 100,000 children out of poverty, but actually be available, I think it's to 500,000 children. But I think something that hasn't been recognised from the spending review so far from slippage, there's actually action being taken, is it's not just feeding kids during term time. Because of our 3-year funding settlement on the Household Support Fund, now called Crisis and Resilience Fund, holiday hunger there, and the DFE's commitment to the holiday activities and food programme will feed poor kids at school and in the holidays too, because kids don't stop being hungry when they're on holiday. So I think that's really important. But if I can just take a step back for the child poverty strategy here. Social security measures are essential to bringing those numbers down. But we've also got to do more on 3 other fronts. Firstly, bringing down the costs families face, particularly around their utility bills, and I'm very proud of what we've done again on the warm homes front, extending that to an additional 2.7 million families. The warm homes discount, I think that's going to really help. But we've also got to get more people into work. The lone parent employment rate has stalled. We need to do more to get second earners into work. We had very clear evidence on the Child Poverty Task Force that having a second earner in part-time or full-time work was a really strong protective factor on child poverty. But the other element of this, I think, is the very, very, very early years of life. We now know just how important those first few years are for children's brain development, social development, I ran a charity called the Maternity Alliance before I became an MP, and those very, very early years, pregnancy in the first 2 years, how important they are. And so our announcement about rolling out Best Start family hubs is absolutely critical. So I see the child poverty, I understand, inevitably the focus on the child poverty strategy has been about social security measures, but actually it's much broader than that. Yes, it's about that, but it's about work, It's about the best start in life, and it's about financial resilience for families. So many families, one thing goes wrong, you know, the cooker breaks, the washing machine goes, and they are plunged into poverty. So we have got to take action on a broad range of fronts here. I am very proud of the start we've made. We have got a hell of a long way to go, but I think we've had some down payments on our child poverty strategy, and myself and Bridget Phillipson will be forging forward to do even more in the autumn.
Jill German.
Thank you, Chair. So I'm a Welsh MP, and so in Wales there's been an awful lot of work to try and mitigate the impact of child poverty. So things like work on the cost of the school day, and universal free school meals for primary school children, and our long established breakfast clubs, which have been in place for 2 decades, I believe. But despite these measures, child poverty in Wales remains stubbornly high. So I believe really strongly that joint working between our UK government and, in my case, the Welsh government is absolutely crucial to be able to make a difference with child poverty, and not just mitigate the impact, but actually drill down into the root causes. So I wondered if you could tell me how the government will work with the devolved administrations to deliver the child poverty strategy, accounting for devolved policy areas that are likely to impact child poverty outcomes. So of course, Bridget Phillipson is working in education here in the UK government, but we'll have a Welsh Government equivalent. They'll be the same in Scotland, and how that will look.
Well, we've actually, it's been a really important part of the work of the Child Poverty Task Force, is to make sure that we take action in every part of the United Kingdom, including in partnership with the Welsh Government and the Scottish Government. We've actually had meetings around this topic with all the key players, including voluntary sector organisations. It's not only what the state can do, but what voluntary and other community groups can do. From the DWP's perspective, I was talking about the importance of helping everybody who can work to get into work. We've got a Get Britain Working Trailblazer, £10 million, I think it is, in Wales, which is trying to get more people into work, keep them in work, which is absolutely critical to tackling child poverty. There'll obviously be the Barnett consequentials for the Welsh Government from some of the other action that we've taken. You know, you are providing free school meals already, but that support that would have been available is obviously going to be devolved. I think there's a lot more we can do in terms of learning from what the successes that Wales is having, but critical to me is those very, very early years, working with the local NHS in particular to help parents during the early years of life, but also secondly is creating those good quality jobs in every part of the country, because that is the best route out of poverty in the long term.
Will there be continued discussions with the Cabinet Secretaries in the devolved administration?
Absolutely.
So health, of course, you've mentioned, education, absolutely crucial to have joint working so it replicates what's happening in this place.
Absolutely, and we're already doing that. That will continue until and beyond when the strategy is published, but particularly, as I've said, on the employment support side, you know, we've got a big manifesto commitment to devolve more so that we get it right in Wales. We're working closely with the Welsh Government on that, but all of my counterparts want to make sure in every part of government we have that close working and that we deliver through, whether it's through the NHS, through local government, through employment support, because the truth is it's only when we do that together that we're going to get the best results for our children everywhere.
Thank you, and let's hope we can see those figures coming down.
They will be.
My greatest wish. Thank you.
John Milne.
Thank you, Chair. And just want to move on to another area, housing, very important issue nationally, and indeed in my constituency of Horsham, where, as it happens, I'm attending a local housing summit tomorrow on affordability. So I'm hoping to pick up a couple of tips, advice from you today. So the temporary accommodation subsidy allows local authorities to reclaim from the DWP up to 90% of LHA rates from 2011 after exercising their homelessness duties. So 2 questions from that. Why only 90% reclaim, and what's so special about 2011?
I have a go. So that, as you say, Mr. Milne, it's a long-standing situation since 2011. In 2011, the reason it's 90% is the policy has always been to encourage local authorities. As you say, there's a subsidy is paid up to a certain amount, but it was to encourage local authorities to look at the cost of temporary accommodation and to have an incentive to seek to reduce that, both in terms of reducing the number of people who rely on temporary accommodation, but also to reduce the cost of the temporary accommodation that is in place. So at 2011 levels, and it hasn't moved since then. There is some advantage in that, in the sense that in 2011 the local housing allowance was set at the 50th percentile, rather than it subsequently was reduced to the 30th percentile. But obviously over a period of time, as the cost of temporary accommodation has gone up, so that so-called subsidy gap has increased over time. Ultimately, it's a fiscal decision to be made about how to manage the spend that's made on housing. At the end of the day, when it comes to housing, there's a conversation to be had about both the demand side, of which this is a focus on, and the supply side. And successive governments, well, particularly this government, as we've seen in the spending review, have seen the key thing here, the thing that really makes a difference, is to build more social and affordable homes. And decisions can be made about where you put government funding, but ultimately the thing that makes the biggest difference is to increase the stock of housing. So what you'll have seen in the spending review is a commitment to £39 billion of additional investment in social and affordable housing over the next 10 years. Obviously, by doing so, you reduce the pressure on temporary accommodation because you've got more long-term housing available for people. That reduces the pressure on rents, reduces the cost, and would have downward pressure on the subsidy, so-called subsidy gap. But I do understand, and I hear it from local authorities all the time, I do understand exactly the point you've made. There are just choices to be made about where to put the money and how to make the investment. But I think, as I say, government's priority is increasing house building. That ultimately is the solution to the housing challenges that we face.
I just wanted to emphasise that point. Housing is a massive issue in my constituency in Leicester. It's the single biggest issue in my constituents. And I'm only too well aware of the pressures on local authorities. But ultimately, we've got to start shifting the focus onto precisely what the Permanent Secretary said, which is, building more social and affordable housing. And £39 billion over this spending review, the biggest ever investment into building those homes. And the Deputy Prime Minister said a target of 60% of those homes, I think, was social housing, because I don't want anybody in temporary accommodation. I'll just link you back to our previous discussion about child poverty. We've got 166,000 children in temporary accommodation. I met mum with two very small kids in Leicester West, a few months ago, actually in one of the early years settings, saying, how can she bring her kids up there? What is the future for them? They keep having to move around. They haven't got anywhere decent to be on their own. When they get to school, how are they going to do their homework? How long will it take them to get there? The state of the accommodation. So the long-term decision for the government is, how do you really solve that problem? I know about the immediate pressures on the council, believe you me. I face that every day. But we have to, we are faced with those choices, and our choice is to shift the focus on tackling the long-term problem, which is we don't have enough housing, decent housing in this country, affordable, social. That is how we want to get ourselves out of this bind, because the amount of money that we are spending on housing benefit, often for poor quality housing that we don't want. We're introducing a bill on renters' rights, private rented accommodation. If we don't take the long-term decisions facing the country, if we only face, they are immediate problems. But we can't duck that. I think it's been ducked for too long. So that is our approach. I'm very aware of that, and I will keep that under constant review. And I know the Deputy Prime Minister is very focused on these issues as well, but we've taken some big long-term decisions. that we need, and we've really now got to deliver.
I completely agree with the long-term ambitions and necessity. However, the short-term problems are considerable, and my Labour constituency of Crawley, for instance, is suffering very greatly from temporary accommodation issues. But I'll move on.
One thing I would say is, if you have a discussion in Horsham about these problems, we genuinely do want to see and hear local experience about what might make a difference. If you're having a housing summit and some of these issues discussed, feed it into us, feed it into Angela Rayner's department, because we want to deliver in every part of the country, no matter which party is represented there. Our job is to deliver for everyone, so do let us know, and we will do everything we can to support you.
Very happy to do that.
Can I actually build on that? Because as a counting officer, I'm responsible for the money that we spend on housing benefit and support to housing through universal credit, which is tens of billions of pounds a year. And as the Secretary of State says, a good chunk of that goes into poor quality accommodation in the private rented sector, which I feel particularly strongly about as the accounting officer and thinking about the value for money for that. So it's absolutely, if you or other colleagues in the committee with your councils, your local housing associations or other housing providers have ideas for how we can use that money differently, we'd be up for that, because we want an innovative approach to get best value for this money.
Okay, I shall pass that on tomorrow. So one other question. The government also said it intends to merge discretionary housing payments and the household support funds into a new crisis and resilience fund. So how do you think this might work in practice? And for example, will any funding for needs such as housing be ring-fenced within that?
So this is a really, personally, has been a really big, important thing for me since coming in as Secretary of State, that we have now secured the first ever 3-year funding settlement for what is currently the Household Support Fund, but we want to turn into a Crisis and Resilience Fund, which includes now discretionary housing payments. That'll be, I think it's a huge step forward. I know from my own council, having just every 6 months doesn't enable them to plan properly. And I think that support, actually we had a big event yesterday with 600 different stakeholders, local authorities, voluntary groups and others about, okay, how can we use this money? Yes, for emergency payments still, because that will be required, but to begin to shift it towards helping to tackle some of the root causes of these emergency problems, and to build resilience within families and communities. Again, I've been quite influenced by my own city, where we have looked at, for example, getting our volunteers in our food banks to start, as many already are, signposting people to debt advice, welfare advice, to maybe employment support, or particularly mental health support. We did a big project in Leicester where we found Food Bank Plus, where we found huge, stating the obvious, you will know this if you're involved with your food banks locally, just how many people have mental health problems who are relying on our food banks. So how do we join that up more? How do we support voluntary organisations, which can be so much the glue that can help bring people together, but who have, whose funding has been decimated over the last 14 years? How can we support those voluntary groups to better link people with support? So that will remain. We've got the discretionary housing payments as part of that. Also the holiday hunger programme, that's for support during half terms and other things. That will remain, but we want to allow local areas to decide how best to shift that support. We're also, everybody will be, but moving away from food banks to more food pantries, social supermarkets, so that they become more sustainable. People pay a little bit for the food, but they also might be able to get employment or training or childcare advice. So we want to start to try and shift that funding into more of the resilience preventative measures, which we know can make such a difference. And I think by having that 3-year security of funding, I certainly know from my own constituency that will really help people plan and build up that capacity. And I wasn't able to be at the event yesterday, but that's really important for me, that we understand what more local communities want from that sort of funding. I think it will make a big difference.
To the specific question of ring fencing?
I'm actually less in favour of ring fencing, because I think that local authorities often know best how they can support things locally. We'll want some clear objectives, some outcomes that we're looking for, but in terms of how that money is best spent, I mean, coming back to Horsham, they'll know locally best what they want to spend it on. I'm not into the business of telling people exactly what. We want some clear outcomes and objectives, but I'm much more in favour of giving more local freedom where that works.
One of the things we need to make sure we can do is bring upper and lower tier authorities together in terms of coming up with the best solution in their areas. Obviously, discretionary housing payments were generally paid not to lower tier because they're responsible for housing as well as unitaries.
They're coming together in a rather big way in a couple of years, but anyway.
Coming together exactly in Sussex and Surrey, it will be clearer in that respect. But I think it's a great opportunity, as the Secretary of State says, for the different parts of local government to come together around what really matters in their areas. And the subsequent engagement after yesterday's event, we've got events around the issues around food banks, as the Secretary of State says, around housing, around crisis and emergency, but also, as the Secretary of State says, around resilience and long-term planning. So really keen to hear the views of stakeholders on all four of those elements of the plan going forward.
I mean, we, as part of our local poverty strategy, I mentioned this earlier, one of the things that we found that particularly plunged families into poverty in Leicester was white goods going wrong. So now we are setting up, we're trying to set something up where people can get decent white goods as a replacement instead of getting another one on loan, more debt. Obviously, the root cause of poverty is not enough people able to have good enough jobs and the cost being too high. But there are other things that we can do locally. That was right for us in Leicester. It might not be right in Horsham, but I think there's a lot more practical things that we can do to support people. And I hope this huge investment over the next 3 years will really make a difference.
A quick one from Danny Kruger.
Thanks. I mean, this sounds like quite a substantial change in the purpose of the existing funds. What I hear you saying is that you're going to shift the funding from essentially grants to households to grants to social infrastructure of various sorts. And I appreciate you're leaving the discretion to the local authorities, but that might in practice be what happens. Is that correct?
So it's both, because I know my own city will still need some of those emergency food vouchers, the emergency payments for people who would otherwise be evicted and at risk of becoming homeless.
I get the argument, sorry to interrupt.
But it's I would say it's not a directive, it's saying enabling local authorities.
In practice, what might happen is the budget that's currently available for households in emergency will decrease, and there'll be instead investment in local social infrastructure.
Both will remain available. This is about enabling local authorities. As actually, I have to be honest, many of them have already begun to do that. The reason I'm very interested in this, because we have, in my own city, begin to shift some of that funding within existing rules, but it's saying that is, we are enabling that, because if in local areas we believe that is a better way of preventing that emergency demand on money, that is a better thing.
Thank you so much, Chair. And we would like to come to the issue of fraud and error, if we can. Obviously, we talked about it when you came in November, and previously we highlighted some evidence that DWP was taking efforts, and since then, obviously, the fraud bill's passed, which is welcome. But we'd also highlighted evidence that in terms of the kind of bounce back post-COVID, DWP's performance was behind that, and lagging that of the private sectors in terms of dealing with fraud. Since we last spoken, what steps have you taken to try to remedy that and to push forward with kind of practical measures to bring down fraud and error?
I address that. Well, since we last met, we obviously published the latest fraud and error statistics, for 2024-25. That was in May, and indeed on Thursday we published the annual report and accounts with a very long section on fraud and error, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a subsequent hearing. So what you'll have seen is that fraud and error in the benefit system has come down since the year before, from 3.6 to 3.3%. In universal credit, it came down from 12.4% to 9.7%. It's still a little bit above where we were pre-pandemic. Pre-pandemic, it was 9.4% for universal credit and 3.1% for the whole benefit system as a whole. But we made promising steps forward. And we have our full fraud and error strategy, of which key parts, as you say, are being taken forward through the bill. But what the annual report and accounts does is it goes through all the things that we've currently been doing and the progress that we've made. So we set ourselves a target for last year of making savings of £1.7 billion. I'm glad to say we overachieved that. We achieved savings of £2 billion. But one of the things that we've started to try and do more of, because we've tended to focus quite a lot in the statistics and the work we talked about in terms of detection, which is when the fraud has already happened, you're then chasing the fraud down and trying to get it back, which obviously has a downside in the sense the money's already gone out the door. But also what you end up with is claimants with overpayments that you then have to get back, and that may be a difficult thing to do for a variety of different ways. So an increasing focus on prevention. One of the things we've published in the annual report and accounts this year, for the second year in a row, but it's some indicative statistics that we've been producing that look at the overall effort of the department in terms of tackling and preventing fraud as a whole, and preventing fraud through all the different controls that we've got in place, as well as new things that we're bringing in, such as the eligibility verification measure in the bill, such as the periodic redeclaration that we're asking people to do on a regular basis, and the UC verification work on things like capital and self-employed income. So a variety of things that are being done in addition, but they're also intrinsic controls already. So I did actually have the table in front of me. This is now published, and it's page 99. It shows that we prevented or detected fraud last year of £24.9 billion, which is up from £21.9 billion the year before. So when you look at the scale of fraud that actually happened, fraud and overpayments of 9.5 billion, a much greater amount of that was actually detected and prevented in the first place, or detected after the event and clawed back. So it's a sense of really trying to give a bit of weight to what I really want us to do as a department, which is get ahead of the problem rather than be detecting it and clawing money back after the event, stopping it happening in the first place. And I think publishing this in a regular format, I think, will be helpful for the committee in holding us to account for that.
And that was also brilliant. Blue Peter, here's one I made earlier moment, and it's very good. I suppose the other part of that kind of you're picking up is around increased automation and using a lot more AI and kind of tools, predictive tools to, as you say, try to stop problems before they begin, both for fraud but also for error, because obviously we don't want either, as you say, people being underpaid or being making a perfectly legit claim that there's no fraudulent intent, and then they're overpaid, and then they're put through hardship when it has to be recovered. Obviously the big challenge for the department's always been beforehand, kind of the data infrastructure, the skills and the IT to successfully kind of use that. Do you think you've got the right infrastructure, data and capabilities to drive that automation forward?
Well, it's a good question, and one of the reasons for taking the powers in the bill is to get more access to data to enable us to do that, but do that in a fair way, in an appropriate way, in a way that is transparent and understandable to Parliament and to our customers. At the moment, we only use one machine learning tool in scaled up version, and that is for universal credit advances. And we carry out a fairness test of that, which we'll be publishing shortly, just to give you a bit of a sense of that. It does make a difference. It does. What that does is it enables us to identify automatically those, it's for universal credit advances, those universal credit advances applications that look fraudulent or suspicious. It sort of filters them off to be able to, for us to look at manually and to test. I mean, it delays the payment by about a day, but it gives us we think 3 times more certainty in terms of being able to tackle fraud and error. That's the one we're using at the moment. As I say, we'll be publishing the fairness test on that shortly, so you'll be able to look at that. We want to be able to go further. These steps are easier to say and more difficult to deliver, but it's definitely the area we want to get into. At the moment, we have many thousands of colleagues in DWP. They're excellent colleagues, they're very expert, but it is a big part of the workforce of DWP working to both detect and prevent fraud and error. And I think we could be more effective and help support those colleagues to do their job even more effectively with better use of technology, particularly things like machine learning, but we need to get it right, need to put it through all the governance tests that you would expect, and we need to be able to present why we think it's fair and not delivering perverse outcomes as a result. And so we're committed, as I say, we're publishing the first of these fairness tests shortly, hopefully I think intended to be before the summer recess. You don't hear me say that very often, but we're shortly planning to do that. And yeah, keen to hear your views about whether this is giving you the transparency that you need to hold us to account.
Look forward to that. You've got a couple of days left. Did you have any more questions, Dave?
I was just going to say, overall, it's obviously absolutely essential that people have confidence that every pound being spent goes to those who really need it and have the right to that support. I don't think it's acceptable that we inherited a situation where I think it's 7.4 billion specifically on benefit fraud a year. I'm really proud we've updated our powers through the fraud and error bill for the first time in 14 years. But I think there's much more that we can do. Look, our challenge is technological advances are proceeding at an unbelievable rate. We want to make best use of those so that we can prevent fraud and error from happening in the first place. We do have a lot of brilliant staff working on that, but there's more that we could do automatically. But we have to have the right framework, accountability and governance in place. But that is a challenge for the government as a whole. We're actually working very closely with Peter Kyle and DCIT to make sure that we use the opportunities but deal with the problems. And people want to have confidence. I see two things. I see organised criminals getting away with huge scams on the benefit system, and I see the problems we've had on carers allowance with overpayments and people with that being chased. So I'm really pleased that we've now got funding for automatic alerts to go direct to carers to say, you've actually gone over where you should be, have a look at the system, because they're busy, caring, working. We have to use all the technologies we can to make sure those errors don't happen up front. But we've got to get that balance right, and that isn't job done. I think the private sector, there'll be lots that we can learn about what they're doing on tackling fraud and error and scams. But we are a government department that deals with very often vulnerable people. So it is an ongoing challenge for the government, which I'm absolutely sure the committee will hold us to account for.
Just very briefly, and thank you, and that's very helpful. I just want to come back to one thing you said, Permanent Secretary. So I think I'm right in saying that UC accounts for roughly 24% of benefits paid, but 76% of all fraud and error. So there's clearly one benefit, and I think you said the fraud rate comes down from 12% to 9%, 9%, but that's still almost that's £1.10 basically. Is there anything specifically extra we're doing for UC? Because that feels like a real, the nub of the problem.
Yes, it's a contrast between universal credit at 9.7% and the state pension, which is a fraction of that. And it's down to the challenge you've got is around the nature of the benefit and the entitlement and the nature of the claimants and what happens in their lives. So from someone on a state pension, to be eligible for the state pension, you need to have a national insurance contribution record, you need to be over the state pension age, and there's a residency requirement as well. Apart from that, you get the state pension, and then the state pension is kind of constant. throughout the rest of your life. Whereas with universal credit, there are any number of different requirements in terms of things like, obviously income, but earnings from income, the fraud and error rate on that is virtually zero for employed income because we get the feed from the HMRC. But on something like living together, where you don't have that data and people's lives change, on things like capital, people's lives change, on things like number of children, the age of children, childcare costs. There's a whole range of different elements that you need to have more information to be able to assess. So, and people's lives change regularly. Now, we compare the performance of universal credit with the performance of the legacy benefits that it was based on, because working age benefits, by their very nature, for that reason, there's more risk. And we're seeing an improvement in that over time. We saw a big increase in fraud and error in universal credit through the pandemic, but that was because we had hundreds of thousands, literally, millions of extra people coming into universal credit in a matter of months. And we had to suspend some of the kind of face-to-face type checks that we normally do, because we thought the priority was to get money to people who were entitled to it, and to get money out the door, which I think we did successfully. But that's why we saw the peak in which we're coming down from. We're committed to reducing fraud and error in universal credit and other benefits to below the pre-pandemic level. And indeed, in the annual report and accounts, another advert for the document, you'll see our forecast set out for how we would bring down fraud and error, both for universal credit and for the wider benefit system over the course of the next few years.
Thank you.
And that concludes our session this morning. Thank you so much, Secretary of State, Permanent Secretary.
Pleasure.
Order.